Sometimes it isn't the loud moments that break you, but the quiet ones. The ones where you realize that the people you trusted most have already moved on without you. For a long time, I told myself I was imagining things. I said it was just stress, just age, just the natural distance that grows when families get busy with their own lives. But deep down, there was a feeling I couldn't ignore, a slow ache that whispered I was no longer essential in the lives I had built from scratch. I used to be the center of everything, the one who remembered appointments, birthdays, school meetings, the one who held everything together without ever asking for recognition. My days were once full of purpose, even when they were exhausting. I believed that love was proven through sacrifice, that being needed was the same as being valued. It took me years to understand how wrong that belief was. The shift didn't happen overnight. It came quietly, disguised as independence. They said they were busy, that they didn't want to burden me, that I should rest more. At first, those words sounded caring. I welcomed them. I thought it meant I had done my job well, that I had raised capable people who no longer needed constant support. But slowly, the phone calls became shorter. The visits became rare. Decisions were made without asking my opinion. Conversations happened around me, not with me. I noticed how plans were discussed as if I weren't sitting in the same room. I became someone they updated, not someone they included. That realization was painful, but what hurt more was how easily I accepted it. I convinced myself this was the natural order of things, that my role was to step back quietly and be grateful for whatever attention remained. I didn't want to be seen as demanding or difficult. I didn't want to lose the little connection I still had by asking for more. So I stayed silent. Silence, I believed, was the price of peace. What I didn't realize was that silence was slowly erasing me. There were moments when I wanted to speak up, to say that I felt forgotten, that I felt invisible in my own family. But each time, I stopped myself. I didn't want to sound dramatic. I didn't want to create conflict. I had spent my entire life smoothing things over, keeping harmony at any cost. It was who I was. Or at least who I thought I was. Over time, I started shrinking my needs, my opinions, my presence. I learned how to make myself smaller, so others could feel comfortable. I laughed when jokes were made at my expense. I nodded when decisions affected my life, but weren't mine to make. I told myself that love meant understanding, that patience would eventually be rewarded. But patience, when it isn't mutual, turns into neglect. And neglect has a way of hardening into truth. The day everything finally became clear wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no argument, no single cruel sentence. It was a casual conversation, spoken without malice, that revealed exactly where I stood. I realized in that moment that I had been slowly written out of my own story. I wasn't angry right away. I was stunned. Shock has a way of numbing emotion before it allows pain to surface. I sat there listening, nodding, pretending I was fine, while something inside me quietly broke. For the first time, I didn't feel needed. I felt tolerated. And that realization changed everything. It forced me to confront a question I had avoided my entire life. Who am I when I am no longer useful to others? That question terrified me, because I had never built an identity outside of service. My worth had always been measured by how much I gave, how much I endured, how much I put others first. Without that role, I felt empty. But emptiness, I later learned, can also be a beginning. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed years of memories, moments I had dismissed, signs I had ignored. Patterns emerged that I could no longer deny. I saw how often I had been last on the list, how often my needs were postponed indefinitely. I realized that waiting for appreciation was keeping me trapped in a cycle of disappointment. Something shifted inside me. Not anger, not revenge, but clarity. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the truth without softening it. I wasn't being valued the way I deserved to be. And the hardest part was accepting that no one was going to fix that for me. If my life was going to change, it had to start with me. That realization didn't come with confidence or excitement. It came with fear. Change always does. But beneath that fear was something new, something fragile yet powerful. A sense that maybe, just maybe, I was allowed to choose myself. That thought lingered with me as the night stretched on, quietly rewriting everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and my place in the world. In the days that followed that realization, I moved through my routines like someone watching their own life from a distance. Everything looked the same on the surface, but nothing felt the same inside. I noticed details I had overlooked for years. The way my opinions were politely ignored, the way decisions were announced instead of discussed, the way my presence felt optional rather than essential. It wasn't cruelty that hurt the most, it was indifference. Cruelty at least acknowledges your existence. Indifference erases it. I began to understand that I had trained the people around me to expect my silence, my compliance, my endless understanding. Every time I swallowed my feelings to keep the peace, I reinforced the idea that my comfort mattered less. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a slow, mutual pattern built over years. That realization was uncomfortable, because it meant I couldn't place all the blame outside myself. I had participated in my own disappearance. I remembered moments when I had felt hurt but chose not to speak, times when I had said it's fine, when it clearly wasn't. I had believed that love meant self-sacrifice, that loyalty meant endurance. No one ever taught me the difference between being selfless and being self-erasing. As these thoughts settled in, I felt a mix of grief and anger. Not explosive anger, but a quiet, heavy kind that sat in my chest. I grieved the version of myself who had waited patiently for appreciation that never came. I grieved the years I had spent prioritizing everyone else's comfort over my own truth. Yet alongside that grief was something else, something unfamiliar: resolve. For the first time, I stopped asking why they treated me the way they did and started asking why I allowed it. That question changed the direction of my thoughts entirely. I began paying attention to my own reactions instead of theirs. I noticed how quickly I minimized my needs, how instinctively I stepped back when I felt tension. These habits were so deeply ingrained that they felt like part of my personality, but I was beginning to see them for what they were. Survival strategies from a time when being agreeable felt safer than being honest. Understanding this didn't immediately give me confidence, but it gave me awareness. And awareness is always the first crack in the wall. I started experimenting with small changes, not dramatic confrontations, just quiet shifts. I paused before agreeing to things. I allowed silence to exist instead of rushing to fill it. I expressed preferences, even when my voice trembled slightly. Each small act felt risky, like stepping onto unfamiliar ground, but nothing catastrophic happened. The world didn't collapse. No one abandoned me in response. That realization was powerful. It showed me how much fear had been exaggerating the consequences of self-expression. As I reclaimed these small pieces of myself, I also became more aware of how deeply I had tied my identity to being needed. Without that role, I felt strangely unmoored. There were moments when loneliness crept in, not because I was alone, but because I was no longer overextending myself to feel connected. That loneliness forced me to sit with myself in a way I never had before. I began asking questions I had avoided for decades. What do I actually enjoy? What do I want my days to feel like? Who am I when I'm not constantly giving? These questions didn't have immediate answers, but asking them felt like an act of self-respect. Slowly, I started filling my time with things that brought me quiet satisfaction. Not because they were productive or impressive, but because they felt true. I took walks without a destination, read books without rushing to finish them, allowed myself rest without guilt. Rest, I discovered, is radical when you've been conditioned to earn your worth through effort. As my inner world shifted, my perspective on the past also softened. I stopped viewing my earlier choices as mistakes and started seeing them as lessons shaped by who I was at the time. Compassion replaced self-blame. I understood that I had done the best I could with the understanding I had then. Growth doesn't mean rejecting your past, it means integrating it without letting it define you. That realization gave me a sense of continuity instead of regret. I wasn't starting over as someone new. I was becoming more fully myself. The clarity I was gaining didn't come with dramatic confidence or bold declarations. It came quietly, in the form of steadiness. I felt more grounded, more present in my own body and decisions. I began trusting my instincts again, listening to that inner voice I had silenced for years. It wasn't loud or demanding. It was calm and consistent, guiding me gently toward alignment. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was standing on my own side. And that shift, subtle as it seemed, marked the beginning of a life that would no longer be built around being overlooked. As I became more aware of my own patterns, I also began to see how deeply they were woven into every relationship I had. It wasn't just my family, it was friends, neighbors, even casual acquaintances. I had learned to be the easy one, the accommodating one, the person who never made waves. People often praised me for being understanding, but I began to realize how often that praise was a reward for my silence rather than my strength. The more I paid attention, the more I noticed how quickly others adjusted to the version of me that asked for nothing. They relied on my reliability, my patience, my willingness to show up without being asked, and over time, that reliability became an expectation. I had blurred the line between generosity and obligation, and in doing so, I had taught others that my needs were optional. This realization didn't make me bitter, but it did make me honest. I stopped romanticizing endurance as virtue. I saw how much emotional labor I had been carrying quietly, believing that love meant absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to. That belief had kept me safe once, but now it was keeping me small. I began to question the stories I had told myself about responsibility and worth. Who decided that my role was to hold everything together? And why had I accepted that role without ever renegotiating it? These questions didn't have easy answers, but they created space for something new: choice. I started to understand that many of the roles we play in life aren't assigned to us. They evolve through repetition and silence. And what evolves can also be changed. With that understanding, I became more intentional about how I showed up. I noticed when I felt resentment bubbling beneath the surface, and instead of pushing it away, I listened to it. Resentment, I learned, is often a signal that a boundary has been crossed repeatedly without acknowledgement. It isn't something to be ashamed of, it's something to be examined. When I honored that signal, I felt less reactive and more grounded. I stopped agreeing to things out of habit and started responding from awareness. Sometimes that meant saying no. Sometimes it meant asking for time before deciding. These small shifts felt significant because they challenged an identity I had carried for decades. There were moments of discomfort, moments when I worried I was becoming selfish or difficult. But each time I checked in with myself, I knew the truth. I wasn't taking more. I was simply giving less of what depleted me. That distinction mattered. As I navigated these changes, I also became more selective about where I invested my energy. I paid attention to how I felt after interactions. Some left me drained, others unexpectedly nourished. That awareness guided my choices more than obligation ever had. I didn't cut people off dramatically. I simply stopped overextending myself. I allowed relationships to find their natural balance, even when that balance meant less closeness than before. Not everyone noticed the change right away, but I did. I felt lighter, more present, less burdened by unspoken expectations. I also began to experience a quiet confidence that surprised me. It wasn't loud or performative, it was steady. I trusted myself to handle discomfort without abandoning my values. I trusted that honesty, even when awkward, was kinder in the long run than silent resentment. This confidence didn't eliminate fear, but it reduced its power. Fear no longer dictated my choices, it simply informed them. As I reflected on the past, I started to see my earlier self with more compassion. I recognized that the version of me who stayed silent did so out of love, not weakness. She believed that harmony was something you protected at all costs. She didn't know that true harmony requires honesty, not erasure. Understanding this allowed me to move forward without regret. I wasn't trying to become someone else. I was uncovering the parts of myself that had been buried beneath years of adaptation. I also noticed how my sense of time began to change. I stopped feeling like I was running out of it. Instead, I felt present within it. Each day became less about managing others' expectations and more about aligning my actions with my values. This alignment brought a sense of integrity that I had been missing. I felt whole in a way that didn't depend on external validation. That wholeness made me less reactive to others' behavior. I no longer needed constant reassurance to feel secure. My stability came from within. This internal shift didn't solve every problem or erase every disappointment, but it gave me something far more valuable: agency. I felt capable of choosing my responses rather than defaulting to old patterns. I felt grounded in the knowledge that my worth wasn't tied to how much I gave, or how little space I took up. And as that understanding settled in, I realized that this was no longer just a phase of self-reflection. It was a fundamental change in how I related to the world. I was no longer waiting to be seen. I was learning how to see myself. As this inner transformation continued, its effects began to surface in ways I hadn't anticipated. The changes weren't dramatic enough for anyone else to point out, but they were profound enough for me to feel them in every interaction. I noticed how conversations shifted when I didn't rush to agree or apologize unnecessarily. Pauses appeared where there had once been instant compliance. Those pauses were powerful. They forced others to actually consider my presence instead of assuming it. I began to realize how often people take cues from our behavior about how to treat us. When I stopped signaling that my needs were secondary, the dynamic subtly adjusted. Not everyone responded positively. Some people seemed confused, others slightly uncomfortable. A few even pushed back, testing whether my new steadiness was temporary. In the past, that resistance would have sent me spiraling into self-doubt, but now I saw it differently. Discomfort, I understood, often accompanies change, especially when it disrupts familiar patterns. Their unease didn't mean I was wrong. It meant something had shifted. I allowed that discomfort to exist without rushing to fix it. This was one of the hardest lessons for me. To let tension be present without feeling responsible for resolving it. Over time, I realized that not every uncomfortable moment requires intervention. Some simply require patience. As I practiced this, my sense of self grew stronger. I felt less reactive, less emotionally drained. I was no longer constantly monitoring others' moods to determine my own behavior. That alone freed up an incredible amount of mental space. I began using that space to reconnect with parts of myself I had neglected. I revisited interests I had once abandoned because they felt impractical or indulgent. I allowed curiosity back into my life, exploring ideas without worrying about their usefulness. This reconnection brought a quiet joy, a reminder that my identity extended far beyond the roles I had performed for others. I also became more honest with myself about what I wanted moving forward. I didn't have a detailed plan, but I had clarity about what I no longer wanted. I no longer wanted relationships built on obligation. I no longer wanted to feel invisible in rooms I helped create. I no longer wanted to equate endurance with love. These realizations guided my decisions more effectively than any long-term strategy ever had. I noticed how my body responded differently now. Tension that had once lived in my shoulders and chest began to ease. I slept more deeply. I breathed more fully. It was as if my nervous system was finally receiving the message that it was safe to take up space. That physical shift reinforced the emotional one, creating a feedback loop of calm and confidence. I also started to recognize the difference between being alone and being lonely. I spent more time by myself than I used to, but that time felt nourishing rather than empty. Solitude became a place of restoration, not abandonment. In those quiet moments, I reflected on how much of my life I had spent anticipating others' needs while neglecting my own. I forgave myself for that imbalance, understanding now that self-awareness often comes later than self-sacrifice. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about excusing the past, it's about releasing its hold on the present. As my days took on this new rhythm, I became more intentional about the energy I shared. I chose conversations that felt mutual. I invested in connections that allowed for reciprocity. When interactions felt draining or dismissive, I no longer blamed myself or tried harder to be understood. I simply adjusted my level of engagement. This wasn't withdrawal, it was discernment. And with discernment came peace. I also noticed how my internal dialogue had changed. The critical voice that once questioned every boundary had softened. In its place was a steadier, kinder presence that trusted my judgment. I no longer needed constant reassurance that I was doing the right thing. I could sit with uncertainty without panicking. That ability transformed how I approached challenges. Problems that once felt overwhelming now felt manageable. I trusted myself to navigate them one step at a time. This trust extended into my relationships as well. I stopped trying to control outcomes or manage perceptions. I allowed others to respond as they would, knowing that their reactions were not a measure of my worth. This detachment didn't make me cold, it made me resilient. I remained open, but I was no longer fragile. As I continued on this path, it became clear that I wasn't just setting boundaries. I was redefining my life. I was choosing alignment over approval, authenticity over comfort. These choices weren't always easy, but they were consistent. And consistency, I discovered, builds confidence more effectively than any external validation ever could. For the first time in my life, I felt anchored in myself. I wasn't waiting for permission to exist fully. I was simply doing it. And that quiet certainty marked a turning point. One that would soon ripple outward in ways I couldn't yet imagine. As this new steadiness settled into my daily life, the outside world began to respond in subtle but unmistakable ways. It wasn't that people suddenly became kinder or more considerate. It was that I no longer depended on their approval to feel secure. That shift changed everything. I noticed how some relationships naturally grew quieter, not because of conflict, but because they had been sustained by my constant effort. When I stopped carrying the full weight, those connections either adjusted or drifted. I allowed that to happen without chasing explanations or reassurance. Letting go no longer felt like failure, it felt like honesty. I also became more aware of how much energy I had once spent trying to be understood. I used to over-explain, to soften my words, to anticipate objections before they were voiced. Now I spoke plainly. Not harshly, not defensively, just clearly. If someone misunderstood me, I no longer rushed to correct it. I trusted that the people meant to understand me would, and those who didn't were responding to their own limitations, not my shortcomings. This clarity brought a surprising sense of relief. I felt less tangled in other people's perceptions and more grounded in my own truth. With that grounding came courage. Not the dramatic kind that announces itself, but the quiet kind that shows up consistently. I made choices that aligned with my values, even when they were inconvenient. I said no without justification. I asked for what I needed without apology. Each time I honored myself in this way, the fear that had once accompanied self-assertion grew weaker. It didn't disappear entirely, but it no longer controlled my actions. I learned that fear doesn't need to vanish for growth to occur. It just needs to stop being in charge. As my confidence grew, so did my awareness of the present moment. I stopped rushing through my days as if they were something to endure. I began savoring small details. The warmth of sunlight on my hands, the comfort of familiar routines, the satisfaction of completing something simply, because it mattered to me. These moments grounded me in a way I had never experienced before. They reminded me that fulfillment isn't always found in big milestones. Often, it lives in consistency and care. I also started reflecting on the idea of success. For years, I had measured it by how well I met others' expectations, how seamlessly I managed responsibilities without complaint. Now success looked different. It looked like alignment. It looked like peace at the end of the day. It looked like waking up without a knot of anxiety in my chest. This redefinition didn't make me less ambitious. It made my ambitions more intentional. I pursued things that felt meaningful rather than impressive. I invested in growth that nourished me rather than depleted me. Along the way, I encountered moments of doubt. Old habits don't disappear quietly. They resurface when you least expect them. There were days when I questioned whether I was being too distant, too firm, too focused on myself. But instead of spiraling, I paused. I checked in with my body, my emotions, my values. Each time, the answer was the same. I felt more whole, not less. That consistency reassured me that I was moving in the right direction. I also noticed how my compassion had deepened rather than diminished. By honoring my own boundaries, I became more empathetic toward others' struggles. I no longer took on responsibility for fixing them, but I could listen without resentment. I could offer support without self-sacrifice. This balance felt sustainable, something I had never experienced before. It allowed me to show up authentically without losing myself. As weeks turned into months, the transformation felt less like a process and more like a new normal. I didn't think about it constantly. I lived it. The confidence I had once hoped to achieve through external validation had grown quietly from within. I trusted myself to navigate challenges with discernment and grace. I trusted that I could adapt without betraying my values. That trust was liberating. It freed me from the constant need to anticipate outcomes or manage impressions. I allowed life to unfold without gripping it too tightly. In doing so, I found a sense of ease that had eluded me for years. This ease didn't mean life was free of difficulty. It meant I was no longer at war with myself when difficulty arose. I could face uncertainty with curiosity, rather than dread. I could meet change with openness rather than resistance. And perhaps most importantly, I could look at my life without regret. I understood now that every stage had taught me something essential. The years of silence had shown me the cost of self-erasure. The period of awareness had given me the tools to choose differently. And this chapter, this steady grounded phase, was teaching me how to live with intention. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't seeking validation for choices that felt right in my body and mind. I was simply living, guided by a clarity that felt both earned and gentle. And as that clarity continued to shape my days, I sensed that the most meaningful changes were still unfolding, quietly preparing me for what would come next. By this point, the changes within me were no longer subtle. They were evident in the way I moved through the world, and in how others began to respond. There was a calm authority in my presence that didn't demand attention, but quietly commanded respect. People spoke to me differently, not because I insisted on it, but because I no longer invited dismissal or interruption. I listened carefully, responded thoughtfully, and no longer rushed to fill silence. That silence became a tool rather than a weakness. In conversations, I noticed how much power lives in patience. When I allowed pauses, others revealed more of themselves, sometimes more than they intended. I learned that strength doesn't always come from speaking first or loudest. Often, it emerges from knowing when to wait. This awareness extended beyond conversations and into decisions. I stopped reacting and started choosing. When faced with challenges, I gave myself time to think, to feel, to assess without urgency. The world didn't collapse when I slowed down. In fact, it often became clearer. I saw patterns I had previously missed, how certain demands resurfaced in cycles, how some people relied on my predictability, how others grew uncomfortable when I no longer fit their expectations. That discomfort wasn't mine to resolve. Accepting that was one of the most freeing realizations I had ever had. As I continued to live in alignment with myself, I found that opportunities began to shift as well. Doors I had once knocked on endlessly were no longer appealing, while others opened unexpectedly. These new possibilities didn't always come wrapped in excitement. Sometimes they arrived quietly, asking for discernment rather than enthusiasm. I learned to evaluate them not by how impressive they seemed, but by how they made me feel. If something required me to abandon my values or ignore my well-being, I let it pass. This discernment protected my energy and reinforced my sense of self-trust. I no longer feared missing out, because I understood that not everything was meant for me. With this mindset came a deeper sense of responsibility, not to others' expectations, but to my own integrity. I held myself accountable in ways I never had before. I followed through on promises made to myself. I honored my need for rest without guilt. I pursued growth not as a way to prove my worth, but as an expression of curiosity and respect for my own potential. This internal accountability replaced the external pressure that had once driven me. It felt steady rather than exhausting. I also noticed a shift in how I related to uncertainty. Where I once needed guarantees and reassurance, I now allowed room for the unknown. I understood that clarity doesn't always come before action. Sometimes it emerges through action. This acceptance didn't make me reckless. It made me resilient. I trusted myself to adapt if things didn't go as planned. That trust was built on experience, on the knowledge that I had survived discomfort before and emerged stronger each time. As my resilience grew, so did my sense of gratitude. I found myself appreciating not just positive outcomes but the process itself. Challenges no longer felt like obstacles. They felt like invitations to refine my understanding of myself. Even setbacks carried lessons that deepened my awareness. This perspective didn't eliminate disappointment, but it softened its impact. I could acknowledge frustration without being consumed by it. I could feel sadness without losing hope. This emotional balance was something I had once thought impossible. It was the result of patience, practice, and an unwavering commitment to honesty with myself. In my interactions with others, I became more selective yet more present. I invested in relationships that felt mutual and respectful. I released those that thrived on imbalance or obligation. This wasn't an act of withdrawal, it was an act of care. By choosing where to place my attention, I preserved the quality of my connections. I showed up fully where it mattered, offering genuine support and appreciation. This intentionality strengthened my relationships rather than diminishing them. Over time, I realized that the most profound change was not visible from the outside. It was internal, a quiet confidence that didn't require validation. I felt anchored in my values, flexible in my approach, and open to growth. I no longer defined myself by past roles or future ambitions. I lived in the present with an awareness that each moment was an opportunity to choose alignment. This awareness guided my actions and informed my decisions. It reminded me that growth is not a destination but a practice. Each day offered a chance to listen, to learn, to adjust. And with each choice made from this place of clarity, I felt a deepening sense of fulfillment. I wasn't chasing transformation anymore. I was living it. The journey had taught me that true strength is quiet, that confidence is cultivated, and that authenticity is sustained through consistent self-respect. As this chapter continued to unfold, I sensed that I was being prepared for something greater, not in scale, but in significance. Whatever came next, I knew I would meet it with the same grounded presence that had carried me this far, trusting that I had everything I needed within me. As the days moved forward, I began to realize that this phase of my life was not about proving anything to anyone else, but about finally standing firmly in my own truth without apology. The silence that once felt heavy now felt sacred, like a space I had earned. I noticed how my thoughts had become clearer, less tangled in fear or regret. Decisions no longer came from a place of panic or urgency, but from alignment. I wasn't trying to fix the past or control the future anymore. I was present, grounded, and aware of my own worth in a way I had never experienced before. People around me sensed the shift even if they couldn't name it. Some were drawn closer, responding to the calm certainty in my voice, while others slowly drifted away, uncomfortable with the boundaries I no longer explained or justified. I let that happen without resistance. I understood now that not everyone is meant to walk with you through every chapter of your life. Some people are only meant for certain seasons, and forcing them to stay only creates pain. Letting go became an act of wisdom rather than loss. With that acceptance came a deeper compassion, not just for others, but for myself. I forgave the version of me that had tolerated less than I deserved, the version that stayed quiet to keep the peace, the version that believed love required sacrifice of self. That forgiveness wasn't dramatic or loud. It was gentle and steady, like setting down a heavy bag after a long journey. I no longer replayed old conversations in my mind or imagined different outcomes. I accepted that I had done the best I could with what I knew at the time. That acceptance gave me freedom. I also began to recognize how much strength it takes to change direction later in life, to rewrite patterns that once felt permanent. Society often celebrates reinvention when you are young, but it rarely acknowledges the courage it takes to evolve when you have decades of habits, expectations, and labels attached to your name. I felt proud of myself for choosing growth over comfort, truth over familiarity. That pride wasn't rooted in ego. It was rooted in survival and self-respect. I had faced emotional storms that could have hardened me. Yet I chose softness without weakness. I chose clarity without cruelty. This balance reshaped how I viewed success. Success was no longer about appearances, status, or approval. It became about waking up without dread, about feeling safe in my own thoughts, about knowing that my voice mattered even when I chose not to use it. I found joy in ordinary moments. Quiet mornings, meaningful conversations, the simple act of choosing what felt right instead of what looked right. These moments grounded me in a reality that felt honest and sustainable. I also noticed how my story began to resonate with others. Without intending to, I became someone people confided in, someone they felt understood by. They saw pieces of themselves in my journey, in my mistakes and my growth. I listened without trying to fix them, offering presence instead of solutions. Through these exchanges, I learned that healing is contagious. When one person chooses honesty, it gives others permission to do the same. That realization deepened my sense of purpose. I wasn't meant to be loud or visible in traditional ways. I was meant to be steady, reflective, and real. This understanding gave meaning to everything I had endured. Even the painful moments had shaped my capacity for empathy and insight. I stopped asking why things had happened to me and started asking what they had prepared me for. That question shifted everything. It reframed my experiences as training rather than punishment. I became more patient with life itself, trusting its timing even when answers were delayed. I learned that clarity often arrives quietly, after you stop demanding it. This trust extended inward as well. I trusted my instincts again, trusted my ability to navigate uncertainty, trusted that I would recognize what aligned with me when it appeared. I didn't need everything mapped out to feel secure. I only needed to remain honest with myself. That honesty became my compass. As this chapter neared its close, I felt a sense of calm anticipation rather than fear. I didn't know exactly what awaited me, but I knew who I was now, and that made all the difference. I was no longer defined by what I had endured or what I had lost. I was defined by what I had learned and how I chose to live moving forward. This was not an ending, but a transition, a quiet crossing into a life shaped by intention instead of reaction. Whatever came next would meet a version of me that was awake, grounded, and unafraid to stand alone if necessary. And for the first time, that thought didn't scare me. It reassured me. When I look back now, I understand that this journey was never meant to be loud or dramatic. It was meant to be transformative in quiet, irreversible ways. The greatest shift didn't happen around me, it happened within me. I stopped waiting for validation, stopped hoping someone would finally see my worth, stopped imagining apologies that were never going to come. Instead, I became my own witness. I saw my resilience clearly for the first time, not as something I had to prove, but as something that had always been there, carrying me through moments I once thought would break me. I realized that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply endures. There were days I moved slowly, days when memories resurfaced without warning, but even then I noticed how they no longer controlled me. They passed through like weather instead of settling in my bones. That's when I knew I had healed more than I had allowed myself to believe. I began building a future that wasn't shaped by reaction or resentment, but by intention. I chose how my days would feel, how my energy would be spent, who would have access to my time and heart. These choices were small on the surface, but powerful in impact. I no longer tolerated conversations that shrank me or environments that demanded I disappear to keep others comfortable. Peace became my standard, not a luxury. And with that peace came clarity. I could finally see how far I had come, how much courage it had taken to walk away from familiar pain instead of staying, because it was predictable. That courage deserved recognition, even if no one else applauded it. I gave myself that recognition freely. I learned that closure doesn't require explanations or confessions from others. Closure is something you grant yourself the moment you stop asking why and start accepting what is. It is the moment you choose to stop reopening wounds just to see if they still hurt. It is the moment you stop bargaining with the past and begin investing in the present. That realization felt like freedom. I carried it with me as I stepped into this next chapter, not with bitterness, but with wisdom. I didn't need revenge, dramatic endings, or public victories. My victory was internal, quiet, undeniable. It was waking up without heaviness in my chest. It was trusting myself again. It was knowing that no one could take away what I had rebuilt from the ground up. I had learned how to stand alone without feeling lonely, how to be soft without being weak, how to love without losing myself. These lessons reshaped my understanding of happiness. Happiness was no longer tied to outcomes or other people's behavior. It lived in my ability to remain true to myself regardless of circumstances. And that kind of happiness is unshakable. As I move forward, I do so without carrying the weight of who I used to be or the expectations others placed on me. I carry only what serves me: clarity, self-respect, compassion, and an unbreakable sense of inner stability. I know now that life doesn't always give us the story we imagined, but it gives us the opportunity to become stronger, wiser versions of ourselves if we allow it. I allowed it. I chose growth even when it was uncomfortable. I chose truth even when it meant standing alone. And that choice changed everything. If there's one thing I hope my story leaves behind, it's this reminder: it's never too late to reclaim your voice, your dignity, your direction. You are not defined by how others treated you, but by how you chose to rise afterward. I didn't lose myself along the way. I found myself. And that discovery was worth every difficult step that led me here. This isn't the end of my story. It's the beginning of a life lived on my own terms, with open eyes, steady hands, and a heart that finally knows its own value.